Xarxa, ràdios comunitàries, Barcelona.
My name is Tim Cowlishaw. I'm a technologist in BBC Research and Development, and I work in the Internet Research and Future Services division, which is kind of like a sort of futures or innovation lab for the whole of the BBC. So we have a mixture of people, lots of people from a technology background, from a research background, but also many people who have worked in, say for instance, radio production, people who have done design, and there are a lot of us who have done a little bit of all these things. So there are people who don't fit into a category, but it's I guess a mixture of kind of interaction research people, design people, and technology people, and some of us sit between those categories as well. It's a nice situation to be in and nice people to work with, because you have anyone who doesn't fit cleanly in these categories, it's normally because they have a curiosity, or they have a sort of natural interest in lots of things, and that's a very nice trait to have if you're thinking about the future, if you're thinking about technology. It's nice to have people who have a curiosity about these things and have a diversity of ideas about what they could do with this. So that, I think, is one of the most important aspects of our team, is how we use that diversity to our advantage. So at the moment, we have several. We look broadly at three different areas. One is the future experiences of public media. So we look at things like the types of devices or content formats, or ways of, or new types of technology like VR, like AR, like things like smart speakers. So the ways we can use technology to produce new public media experiences. The second is the way we can use data and machine learning to improve the way we make programs, to improve access to programs. So we do a lot of machine learning and kind of audio and video analysis to understand what is in our archive and to be able to find programs from the archive. And the third, which is my area, is somewhere in between the two, and we call this discovery. So this is to do with the way in which people find programs, articles, media, the way in which they find and discover things they might want to watch or listen to or read. But we treat that as both a data problem and an experience problem. We take one specific kind of need and we work through the whole thing, rather than thinking just about, you know, search and indexing and archives, or just about interface. We have a sort of a practice that tries to look at one specific aspect of this all the way through. So they're our main areas. I think a lot, everyone says this, but a lot of the ways we can use things like machine learning, artificial intelligence are very interesting. I think there's a lot of challenges with that as well. A lot of people make assumptions about how these things can work that they might either be wildly ambitious and not possible, or they might be actively harmful for certain groups of people. So there's a degree of care we have to take as a public organisation in how we research this technology. So this is particularly interesting for us, because we have to be sure we are being unbiased. We have to be sure we are serving everyone. So the particular challenges around using machine learning for a public organisation, I think, are interesting. My personal second area of interest is in augmented reality, but specifically audio for augmented reality. So how we do projects that give people sound experiences that respond to place or location or the space people are in, and which allow interaction, which mix recorded sound with sound from the outside world. So my main focus at the moment is looking at this, but this is it's a very new project, so it's early days, but there's something very interesting there in looking at augmented reality, but taking away the glasses and taking away the visual side and just allowing people to be in the world and see things, but adding things in their ears. So that's a lot of fun. That's a very good question. I think this informs quite a lot of the way we work and the way we discover these technologies, because it's very difficult to convince people to use things that they don't have a motivation for themselves. So the way we work with these technologies is normally to work very closely with audiences and with people to understand what their motivations are for using media, the kind of deep needs which we're satisfying, and we try and work with them to make things that are sympathetic to that. So for instance, one of the examples I think people talk about is things like interactive storytelling, where you think of a drama with some sort of interaction and like a branching narrative where you can choose paths. And so Netflix did this recently and it was very successful, but for years people were trying these types of experiences and no one was interested. And one of the interesting things we've kind of uncovered in research is people are quite happy with interaction if there is a role within the story for that interaction. So if you look at video games, you are a part of the story, so there is a motivation to make those decisions. Whereas if you give someone a story where something is happening and you go, now choose whether Antonio walks down this street or this street, as if they have no role in the story, they go, well, I don't care, I don't know what's going to happen. So it's a lot of whether people are prepared for this and whether people want this is to do with whether the way you frame the use of the technology and whether you're responding to people's needs and people's motivations or not. So we try and be led by that rather than led by just the technology. We do. We use a lot of open source software ourselves. We work a lot on web standards, so we contribute to things like kind of JavaScript APIs and browser APIs, and we do a lot of the work that sort of sets open standards for the web. We try and open source our own work where possible. I think there are often difficulties, kind of legal and business difficulties around doing this, but we try and work in the open where we can. And recently I did a project with 2 students from Queen Mary University who produced an interactive sound art piece, and that we managed to open source, which was really nice, because a lot of this work, often it maybe gets lost a bit. We'll do a project, it'll work well for us, but not many people will get to see it. So where we can, we like open sourcing things so things can have a life beyond the project in our lab. Often the legalities are tricky, but we try, where possible, to share the results of our work. And even if we don't release open source code, we blog about everything. At least every 2 weeks, we will write a summary of what we'll be doing. We'll share research results, if not software. So in general, we try and be as open as we possibly can by default, and hopefully that normally means open source. This is an important aspect of our charter and why we exist. So the BBC exists by a legal agreement called the Charter with the British government, and we have to exist to produce TV and radio and do news coverage. But one of our purposes for the public is to perform technology research and development. So we're not just a research and development department for the BBC, the editorial side of the BBC, to help their jobs. We exist directly to do research and development for the British public. So it's very important in our case that we are open, because we're accountable to our audiences in a way that a private organisation might not be. So there are many ways. We often publish at conferences or in journals the same way that other organisations might. So we go to say, for instance, the International Broadcasting Convention in Amsterdam every year, and we present work there. There's a conference called TVX, which is around kind of experience design for TV, and we are very involved in that. We don't just do academic publishing. We do a lot of blogging, and we publish white papers on our own website, which are there and are publicly available. And we often do public trials of prototypes we've made. So there is a site called BBC Taster, which is a sort of a platform for us to put prototypes of future experiences and future technology we put on there for people to use alongside other organisations too. So very often we don't necessarily publish a research paper, but we'll publish artefacts and we'll show the results rather than telling people what we've done. I think the interesting thing for me is I'm not sure we've worked much on a sort of technical convergence of the two media, but people's attitude to different media is converging. So if you look at younger audiences, more technically savvy audiences, people don't think about the TV as being separate to the radio, as being separate to the internet. It is all just media which you consume through a single device, or a single type of device can use all of them. So I guess we're not thinking about sort of technical ways of combining these things, but certainly the way we produce content for them and the way people react to them, the boundaries are very, very blurred. The same as with the audio AR work I've been thinking about. One of the interesting things about, for instance, doing augmented reality in audio only is the fact that you're leaving people's eyes free to see the world, and you're not placing something in front of them, so you're allowing them to kind of continue to be sociable and continue to engage in the outside world. And this is an interesting sort of motivating example, because the difference, as these media converge on the same devices, we use tablets, phones, computers to consume both audio and video, to consume television and radio. The differences, to me, are mostly about how the media gets used. People listen to, for instance, podcasts when they maybe are commuting or are outside their house, whereas they will tend to watch video when they are sat at home. So the difference is increasingly about people's habits and routines and the things they're using media for, rather than the types of devices or the types of technology. And we find this a useful way of thinking about media, because producing, say, a radio program which someone will listen to in a noisy place while they're travelling is a very different proposition to something they will sit down and give their full attention to at home. So while the technology is converging, people's behaviours and their habits are still different. They still choose different media for different purposes. I'm really interested in augmented reality radio and the way spatial audio and location-based audio can be used for new radio experiences. If you look at how people listen to podcasts and how people listen to music, it's increasingly done out and about when people are travelling, when they're out in the world. So using their situation, using their the kind of context around them, I think is an interesting and valuable thing. We've got a lot of interesting research around binaural spatial audio, so giving people a surround sound experience on headphones. And we're starting to see things like headphones with built-in head tracking, so people can move their head within a soundstage. You can have them kind of things that respond to the direction people are looking in. We're starting to see ways of reproducing sounds that don't block your ears, so you can hear the outside world alongside the things in your ears. And all these things I think are very interesting, because it allows us to produce radio effectively that is very sensitive to people's surroundings and very sensitive to their situation. And I think that will be very, very interesting, because of the way people use radio. People use radio when they are out of the house, when they are out in the world, and finding a way of connecting their listening habits to their surroundings, I think could be a really interesting and exciting thing. Things that are inspiring. I think looking beyond the world of technology and the world of broadcast media is very important. If you look at kind of DIY communities in art and in music, you find a lot of people who are very passionate, who are very curious, and who often take technology and put it to uses for which it wasn't intended. And this can be a great source of inspiration because it shows you ways of using familiar devices and familiar technologies in unfamiliar ways. So that's very important. There's a lot of interesting work going on in things like immersive theatre, for instance, that is very, very interesting. We also do a lot of work with people in education, so people in arts education and in academia and in research, and they very often come to us with really interesting ideas and things we can build upon. So there's a lot of different sources of inspiration, but I think they tend to be generally from outside the world of technology, because we're looking for the unusual and the interesting things people are trying to do, rather than necessarily just the things that technologies have been designed for. I dropped out of a PhD. I did a year in a. I have a slightly mixed background. My first degree was in graphic design and animation. I then accidentally got into computer programming, did a master's in computer science, and then 1 year of a PhD in human-computer interaction. And I dropped out of that and started working at the BBC, and I've never looked back. I did some motion design. I worked designing DVD menus for a large record label, and then I did a lot of kind of web development and software engineering, so at various kind of startups and places like this. Quite often music industry places. That was kind of not planned, but it was a passion of mine, and it was very lucky that I got to work. I got to kind of combine these passions. And then, probably 10 years after I first graduated, I went back to university, and then after that I ended up here. I think broadcast media has a really important social role, so there's a lot of kind of social theory and political theory about how the fact that we all see or listen to the same things, say for instance in the news and the media, is an important part of kind of what binds societies together, and broadcast media has a role in kind of maintaining coherent societies. So I think there will always be a role for that broadcast model of a program or a signal being sent out to anyone who can pick it up. What the technology for that will look like, I don't know. I don't know if perhaps a lot of these things one day will be delivered over IP somehow, and we'll move away from radio waves. But there will always be broadcast in some sense. Community radio, I think, especially can be innovative because you're presumably closer to the people you're serving, so it's a lot easier to understand the needs of your audience and their desires and their wants and what they want from radio, which to me is the main ingredient for innovation. I think a lot of larger organisations suffer from their distance from the people they're serving. So community radio is extra important because you're connected to your community, and your community will kind of direct the way you work in the future and direct the innovation. And this is where great ideas come from listening to and talking to the people who will use the technology. I think there's a tricky balance. I would like the radio of the future to be more sensitive to people's habits, to their routines, to the way they're using the radio. Like I use the radio to wake myself up in the morning. Like I use it as a clock. I use it to find out about the world, and I use it at very specific times for different things. And so I think there's a lot that can be done with kind of sensitivity to habit and to routine and the way people are using things. But it's important to trade that off over the idea of producing things that are ultimately personal. I would like to know that in the future, if if I listen to something, the chances are other people will have heard it too. Like, I think it would be a shame if future radio became so personalised we all had our own very individual experiences. So there's somewhere in between. I think there's an exciting future where you have kind of responsive, sensitive radio services which still speak to everyone at once, and which still give us this shared experience of the world and of the things we're listening to. I think broadcast media in general, and radio in particular, are more important now than they've ever been, because we live in a society in Britain and across the world where divisions between people are deepening, where people are becoming more partisan and more immersed in their own kind of small communities. And the power of broadcast media is the ability to bring people together by making sure we have a common experience of the media we listen to. It produces cohesion, and it gives us the ability to understand people who are unlike ourselves and to hear the experiences of people who are unlike ourselves. So I think, the broadcast media, especially radio, have an important role in helping kind of produce cohesion and removing this some of this division which we're seeing in our society.